Over the years, I've had conversations with more and more of our Beth Am members who have found themselves in the role of caregiver, perhaps for aging parents or spouses with various health issues, or adult children who need extra support, or more and more of us in the sandwich generation caring for aging parents and young kids at the same time. As our congregation ages, we also recognize that this will only increase, this need will only increase. So often these challenges go unseen, thinly hidden by a Shabbat Shalom on Friday nights, driven in part by those providers of care not wanting to themselves be any burden to their friends or family. But as a spiritual community, here at Beth Am, we are supposed to be present for each other throughout our life cycle, the challenging with the celebrating. And so tonight we're at the very beginning of a much bigger conversation that I'd like for us to have as a congregation about how we lean into the value of Bikur Cholim, about how we care for our loved ones, and how we as a community care for both those giving and those receiving care. In the last few years in particular, we've experimented with a couple of small pilot groups that we're calling Caregiver Shema groups. The first was for those caring for aging parents, and another more recent group started about 1.5 years ago for those caring for spouses. The hope of these groups was to provide a setting for caregivers to share some of their struggles and sit in relationship with others who might be going through similar situations. These aren't meant to be therapy groups, but about spiritual and social support. Our hope is that in the coming months, based on the need we identify, really from hearing from all of you and those throughout our congregation, we'll continue to roll out additional opportunities for more groups like these and potentially some additional programming around resources, strategies, and support for caregiving. As I said, we're at the very beginning of a much longer conversation, and our speaker tonight really is and really the broader organization of tonight is really a big thanks to our nascent caregiver task force headed by Sherry Haff and Karen Lawrence, Audrey Axelrod-Smith, Ellen Waxman, and Joyce Reynolds, who've really been the ones leading this conversation, and they're looking for more help too, so it's not just them. There are opportunities to get involved. But tonight it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for this evening, Barbara Kivowit. Barbara is a clinician, consultant, researcher, and author specializing in healthcare innovation with the goal of helping organizations shift to more patient and family-centered models of care. She is the co-author of Love in the Time of Chronic Illness, How to Fight the Sickness, Not Each Other, a guide for patient caregiver partners and for the clinicians who help them. She has delivered programs based on her book at Stanford Healthcare and Stanford Medical Center, a number of other hospitals and medical facilities, medical education facilities around the country. She's a frequent speaker at conferences for patient caregiver groups and for clinicians as well. Barbara is a dedicated advocate for including the voices of patients and families in all aspects of healthcare and social care. Barbara has broad and deep experience as a patient advocate in various health systems throughout the Bay Area. She's deeply involved in governance and advisory roles within the larger healthcare community and actively participates in state and national initiatives promoting patient and family-centered care through a variety of different organizations such as the National Institute for Health Aging Initiative and California Health Compares. She previously led the innovation practice for a research and development group with IBM, provided innovation strategy consulting to large healthcare organizations and to the state of Vermont, and worked as a clinical social worker in community-based settings and as an advocate with Spanish-speaking refugee populations. She has graduate degrees from Harvard and Simmons Universities and speaks 5 languages. She'll be delivering tonight's talk in Aramaic. No. She's an avid hiker and traveler and writer and has been published in several literary journals and was nominated for a Pushcart Prize. Barbara, it's my pleasure to welcome you and your husband Richard to Beth Am and to call you up to our bima.
Wouldn't you be surprised if I started in Aramaic.
I would be shocked. That would be amazing.
Ani lo medaberet Aramaic.
Oh, there you go.
That was a wonderful and moving service. And it took me right back to Flushing Jewish Center in Queens that my grandparents founded. And I'm always amazed when I go shul hopping, how the music and the words and the formula, it's the same. It's a shared experience and it makes community. And I'm going to borrow that to segue into talking about caregivers and patients, because I think that too is a common experience across ages, across geographies. And at some point in our lives, we all are or will be patients, and we all are and will be caregivers. And to have this conversation in a community like this, I think is very, very rich. It's a wonderful place. This is the first time Richard, my husband, and I have been here, and all I can say is, nice place you got here. So, okay, first slide. So, as Rabbi Heath was saying, I've got a lot of stuff in my bio, but to narrow it down, I'm a clinician, a clinical social worker, a researcher. I live with a chronic pain condition, and I've been a caregiver for both of my parents and at times for my husband, Richard. And our focus today is on the impact of illness on the relationship between the patient and caregiver. There's been a lot of material about the patient experience and a lot of material about the caregiver experience. But there's very little that talks about what happens when illness becomes the third partner in that relationship. What happens to the relationship and what those two people can do to build the relationship resilience needed to carry the very heavy load of illness. Next slide, please. And one more click. So let me just ask you, if you could raise your hand, how many of you have been patients? Okay, everybody. How many of you have been or are caregivers? Okay, everybody. So, and how many of you are currently now both? Patient and caregiver, yes. It's a role, the roles are shifting because our lives always shift. And I want to ask you, if you wouldn't mind, just calling out a word or a couple of words that for you conveys something about the experience of being either a patient or a caregiver. Say again? Fear. Exhaustion. Empathy. Say again? Somebody pass that forward. I couldn't. Anxiety. That was loud and clear. I heard that one. If you notice, the words that you're saying, all the words are very strong words. They're powerful words. They convey a lot. Nobody said anything like, interesting. And I think it takes the strength of two people, the patient and the caregiver, to carry what all those words convey. 2 clicks, one more click. And back to the one with the book, yeah. So my co-author, Roanne, and I, we wrote this book because we were both the ill partners in our relationships. Roanne, when she was in her 40s, had a massive stroke that paralyzed half of her body, and she was caring for her 2 young children. And I came down in 2000 with a mysterious, crippling chronic pain condition that just knocked me out of life. And we were both just gobsmacked by how much our situations, our conditions, affected our relationship with our primary caregiver. For both of us, it was our husband. And it affected every single aspect of it, from the outside world to the inside world, from the kitchen, to the living room, to the bedroom, to the bathroom. It affected everything. And there was nothing out there to help us understand the enormity of the impact, much less what to do about that. So we basically wrote the book that we wish we had had. And we interviewed many, many, many patients and caregivers and experts. We interviewed people in the medical field, doctors and nurses and hospice workers and social workers, palliative care folks, researchers, cancer researchers, Alzheimer's researchers, and people in the spiritual world, rabbis and chaplains and a Tibetan tolku. And one of the things that we learned is that when people are living the experience of being patient and caregiver together, it can be really isolating. It's almost like you have a dome over your life, and it's just the two of you trying to cope. And what we tried to do with this book is to break through that dome and to show that there are commonalities. There are common emotions, there are common experiences, and there are ways of coping. So our attempt was really to break through the barrier. Next slide, please. And I know, you're looking at the dog and you're going, oh, how cute. No, he's cute. And, I'm totally grateful to all the clinicians and specialists and healers who helped me, but I literally would not be here if it weren't for my heroic husband and my magical dog. And that's the digital version of my husband. This is the analog version, sitting right there. Next slide. So why focus on the relationship? Why is the relationship so important? Well, you're at the doctor's office maybe for 15 minutes, and you're given both information and hopefully caring, but then you go home, and the rest of the 23 and a half hours you're spending with each other. And it's that relationship that is the filter through which all aspects of the illness and treatment are experienced. So the relationship determines how the diagnosis is understood, how treatment recommendations are understood, if they're followed or thwarted, what the emotional states are of both people, and how daily life is managed or unravels or is changed dramatically, and how finances are managed. And, when doctors see us, they pour in information, and they only see the patient. They see a solitary unit. They don't appreciate that the patient has potentially a caregiver and a larger community. So they pour information in, and they expect that the information is understood exactly as they meant it, and that their treatment recommendations are adhered to exactly as they wanted. And maybe that happens in 0.001% of the time. And that's because we're not solitary units. We live in connection, and those connections inform our understanding and our behavior. So we heard many, many stories about, for example, a doctor recommending a medication to a patient, and the patient's caregiver says something like, "What do you need that medication for? You're taking 2 medications already, and besides, I don't even know if that doctor's the right doctor for you." And so the patient doesn't take the medication and doesn't tell the doctor. Why? Because they want to be a good patient. So you can imagine the chaos that ensues from that. We also heard stories about a patient who had pain, for example, or just mysterious symptoms or mutating symptoms, and the doctor couldn't figure it out. So the doctor says something along the lines of, I think you should see a therapist. I think it might be psychological. It might be in your head. And the caregiver, who also can't fix it and can't figure it out, starts to think, maybe it is psychological, maybe it is in your head. In the meantime, the patient is feeling it in their body, and they're hurting and they're suffering. And so You have the caregiver thinking it's psychological and the patient saying no, no, and that causes a rift between them, sometimes even a traumatic rift. And that rift is what they have to hold the experience. So all this is to say, it's the relationship that has a profound impact. Somebody help me with time. I'm not paying attention to time. So just wave at me if I'm going over. Next slide, please. So these are two of several patterns that we heard the people we talked to talk about. And I will describe each along with one approach for active coping. And in a longer talk, which I hope to do later on, I'll go into more detail. Next slide, please. So love grows. This was the most surprising finding from the dozens and dozens and dozens of people we interviewed. So many people said that because of the illness, they found themselves focusing more on what matters and what doesn't matter. And what matters is love and compassion. And the illness shined like a giant spotlight on that. And they were able to live in that space more and more. Some people said they communicated authentically for the first time in decades because they pared away the noise of everyday life, the errands and the shopping and the cooking and the cleaning, and they pared that away. And they just focused on saying what really matters. Some people said that they said, "I love you," to their other person every day because they never knew when it was going to be the last time. So the blessing of illness, the blessing of living with illness in your life, and it's a hard blessing, it doesn't come easy. You sometimes have to work to dig it up. But the blessing is that you can focus on your bedrock and what really lives in your bedrock. And don't worry about the dishes in the sink or the fact that your husband leaves his socks in the living room. No, actually do worry about your husband leaving his socks. That's a big deal. I'm not letting that one go. And of course, not everybody finds a compassionate and loving bedrock. For some people, the relationship has just been toxic for a really long time. And they can't find that source of light between them. And sometimes that's okay, because illness shines a bright light. There was one woman who suffered a traumatic brain injury in a car accident. And what she realized is that if her adulterous, philandering, emotionally abusive husband couldn't muster the chutzpah, whatever it took, to be kind to her when she's dealing with a traumatic brain injury, it was never going to happen. And so she realized she would be better off outside that relationship, and she was. Okay, next slide. So carrying the load, I think this is something that many patients and caregivers experience. And by the way, when I say patients and caregivers, it could be spouses, it could be life partners, it could be friends, it could be siblings. It's just a dyad. And it's not a defined person, it's just the patient and the caregiver. And when this happens, when illness becomes the third partner, it can wind up in the driver's seat. And it can wind up making all the decisions. And one of the areas this plays out is in the tasks that partners take on. Many people have said something along the lines of a partnership of equals becomes one of patient and caregiver. And that's a big shift. That's a seismic shift. And there's no denying that in some situations, like in my co-author Roanne's, when she had a stroke and was half paralyzed, she couldn't do the things she used to do, and her husband had to pick up more. But what typically happens, what often happens, is this shift in who does what kind of happens automatically, and it can be a very slippery slope to the patient becoming a passive participant in their lives, and the caregiver becoming overactive, over-engaged, and overextended. So the next slide. One of the tools that I often use with patients and caregivers is I ask them to write down a list of all the jobs that they have to do. They do it separately and they do it together. What are all the jobs? And the jobs often fall into the categories of home, health, and finances. This is the list that Richard and I came up with. And then you assign who can do what. And you put your initials by who can do what. And some things can't be done by the two of you, and then you have to reach out to your community or agencies for help. So this is an organizing tool, but that's not where the value of it is at all. The value is in the conversation. It's in talking to each other about what your lives are like and what you can each take on and what you can't take on, and the negotiations and the understanding what patient can do and what caregiver can do. And for some people, that's the first time they ever had a conversation like that. And any conversation you have about the reality that you're living and about how you are each managing builds connection and builds resilience. And this is just a tool for having that kind of conversation. The next slide, please. So this is another job description. And it's not instead of, it's on top of. And it's about focusing on being rather than doing. It doesn't take away the doing, but it adds being to it. And being, so what does being mean? Being just means what it sounds like, just being together in the moment. And that moment could be just sitting side by side, sitting, for Shabbat services side by side, making it here side by side. It could be walking the dog. It could be looking at photographs. It could be listening to music. When I was at my worst, I wasn't leaving the house. I had to quit my work. I couldn't do anything. No matter how much pain I was in and how bereft Richard was feeling, every Sunday night at 9 o'clock, thank you HBO, we watched The Sopranos together. And that was many seasons. So that was one of the ways that we bead together. So you can invent your own way. Visiting your bedrock. So I talked about your bedrock. Sometimes when you're in the thick of the storm, you're just fragmented by all the things that you have to do. And you can also, illness is tough, and being a caregiver is tough. And that friction can wind up being taken out on each other. There could be lots of twists and turns, in addition to love and compassion. And so when you experience that fragmentation, visit your bedrock, take a breath. I love that you began the service by taking a breath in and a breath out, and going down to your bedrock and saying, what matters most? Okay, there's the socks in the living room, but what else matters most? Where is the love? And if you can't find the love or the compassion for each other, then go down to your own personal bedrock and ask yourself, who do I want to be? What are my values? What do I want to be seen as? What do I want to live by? When my mother was in her final years, we used to argue a lot. And, I would argue with her about her smoking. I would argue with her about her diet, which consisted of chocolate and cottage cheese, separately, not together. And about her social isolation. And then I was getting nowhere, and it was just causing friction and fragmentation. And I went to my bedrock, my personal bedrock. And I said, who do I want to be? What's my value? My value is I just want to be compassionate. That's all. No matter what, I just want to be compassionate toward her. And I shifted my behavior, and it made a difference. I mean, she still cottage cheese and chocolate, but there was a sweetness instead of the friction. And hold the hope for each other. When you're living in the situation, sometimes hope is a casualty, and often we hope for, and why not, but we hope for a cure. And you can hope for that, but that doesn't have to be the only thing you hope for. You could hope for that today will be a better day than yesterday. You can hope to make it to your daughter's graduation from medical school, to your grandchild's wedding. You can hope on anything. You can hope that maybe tonight my husband will cook dinner, maybe. That was a flawed hope. But you can still. But whenever you have hope, it builds resilience. It creates actually a biochemical reaction in your body, and releases the healing hormones. It releases endorphins. Okay. So one of the things I did when I was like in the pits was I had an image in my mind of a menorah. And in each of the candle holders of the menorah, I placed somebody who could help me hold the hope. Because there would be some days when I was hopeless, and I would go to Richard and I would say, Richard, tell me about hope. Or I would go to Joyce and I would say, Joyce, tell me about hope. So have your menorah of hope holders. And the next slide. So, these partners, these patient and caregiver partners, they're doing the best they can do. And they're straining to do the best they can do. And sometimes it gets messy, and it looks pretty messy, and we're worn down by the heavy load of illness. And we can be afraid and angry and hurting and desperate and hopeful, and call on our resilience and our relationship resilience, and especially a superb, loving community like Beth Am. So as you move through your illness experience, carry this beautiful statement by Maya Angelou. We set the expectation bar so high, but if you can care for another, you've already succeeded, and everything else is already over the bar. And the next slide is at Toda Rabah, and the next slide, and the slide after that, one more. That. So, if you're interested in the book, don't go to Amazon. They screw everything up. Go to the publisher, and you could get the book from the publisher. So thank you very much, and Shabbat Shalom.